Hey y'all, so we are live. Welcome to another episode of Poli Sci with me and my friend Jared. Welcome. So today's topic for the class is the attack on DEI. I'm sure you guys have heard that phrase a lot this past week, as Trump has signed an executive order to roll back DEI or get rid of DEI programs. Could you go into that before we, what does that executive order means before we get into it?
Yeah, so I actually read that. So there were two executive orders. One that was specifically targeting or specifically referring to DEI programs within the government, so like government contractors and stuff. Then the second, which is I think the more interesting executive order, is this executive. So the first one he signed on day one. The second one he signed on January 21st, so his second day in office, and it's called Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity. And so he says here, the purpose is, I'm reading it verbatim, the purpose is, it says Section 1 purpose, longstanding federal civil rights laws protect individual Americans from discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. These civil rights protections serve as a bedrock supporting equality of opportunity for all Americans. As president, I have a solemn duty to ensure that these laws are enforced for the benefit of all Americans. Yet today, roughly 60 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, critical and influential institutions of American society, including the federal government, major corporations, financial institutions, the medical industry, large commercial airlines, law enforcement agencies, I'm almost done, and institutions of higher education have adopted and actively use dangerous, demeaning, and immoral race and sex-based preferences under the guise of so-called, quote, diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility that can violate the civil rights laws of this nation. So, as you all just heard, the executive order says that that the federal government is going to continue to uphold anti-discrimination law, which if you know what the Civil Rights Act was about, that's essentially what it was, essentially barring discrimination on the basis of one's racial status. And they eventually added gender, et cetera, but it was primarily focused on racial status. So that's going to still be standing, except now they won't allow you to, and we can get into this a little bit more, take affirmative action to essentially correct for what people think of as historical injustices. So that's like the upshot of it. So today, I hope we can, what I want to do is try to first talk about my blog post, because I wrote about this. So if people are interested, you can go read it yourself. So that's the first part. The second part is I want to try to historicize diversity, because people are confused. I don't think people understand what diversity has meant kind of over the last, let's say, 50 to 60 years, nor kind of the origins of it and how we ended up here. So hopefully I can shed some light on that.
Yeah. I did read your blog. It was really good. Made me think, of course. It's the one on Substack, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So the link, y'all, if y'all want to look at it, it is in the description already. It says Jared's blog. You should see it if you want to read it.
Also, I'm going to have to be like you now. Also, if you do read it on Substack, even if you don't comment, liking it will boost, because I'm new to this. So I'm trying to grow my audience and things and don't reach people. So even if you don't engage with it that much, just liking it actually goes a long way. So yeah, if you do read, like to.
Yeah. So,
it doesn't mean you actually have to like what I said. Just yeah.
And then what really stood out to me was, the based on merit. So did you want to get into that, meritocracy?
Yeah, so meritocracy is interesting because I actually I have 5 papers I'm working on in addition to my book. So I've been quite active intellectually the last 4 or 5 months. But anyway, I think meritocracy gets a bad rep, and this is why. So, what is meritocracy? So, meritocracy is an ideology, really emerges kind of I would say, really in the 18th century, but really starts to congeal in the 19th century. And really, what meritocracy was a reaction to kind of feudalism and the monarch. So, what's the basis of monarchies? People are where they are because of who they are, the family they were born into. So what you do really doesn't have much bearing in your place in society. Like if you are the child of a king, you're going to be royalty. Whereas if you're born a peasant, you're going to be a peasant, and that's just kind of the extent of it. Like there really isn't anything to contest. And I think one thing we forget is that up until like the 17th century, there really was no articulation of like universal equality. In other words, nobody was under the impression, even in principle, that everybody was created equal. So the fact that we at some point came to accept broadly a principle that everyone is equal. Again, we can get into like what that means. People have different interpretations of like what equality means. So that's not self-evident, but even stating that is itself like a radical break from human history from anything prior. So meritocracy essentially turned the kind of this concept of like divine right and that sort of thing on its head and said that, well, no, like the way that we should organize our society is by making sure that people are rewarded and for what they do and what they're capable of doing and what they contribute to society, as opposed to just who they are. So like it was rejecting this kind of idea that who people are should have any bearing on kind of their place in society, which to me on its face, I think is a cause that most people would probably get around. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem is that meritocracy, and I talk about this in the piece, meritocracy in principle has not been realized in fact. The fact that people can leave their children if you have generational wealth, generational wealth is itself like kind of an affront to meritocracy. We don't want to think about it that way, but it really is. It's a leftover from that kind of, inheritance kind of way of thinking of the world. And so there's been a lot of roadblocks to actually making meritocracy work in fact. And people disagree on like, why don't we have meritocracy in fact? So I am a student of Marx. I'm a socialist. And so I tend to think the reason we don't have I know, right? Like the reason we don't have meritocracy in fact is because of the way we organize our society, i.e. capital, which means that the only way that this capitalist civilization works is if there is a large number of people who have no property but their labor to sell to somebody else, which is inherently unequal. So like under that notion, like there's never going to be universal equality. It's just not going to happen. Not because people are evil, not because billionaires are terrible. Like all those things might be true, but I think it's in the basic way that in our basic social relations, which is why I'm always talking about social relations in this show. Now, other people will say the reason we don't have meritocracy is because of discrimination. So like interpersonal discrimination. So what the Civil Rights Act was trying to do was actually attain meritocracy through the dismantling of discriminatory laws. It succeeded in getting rid of those laws. Like we don't actually have discriminatory laws in the book, not explicitly. Now, people will say that, because of certain histories, some laws are just by their nature more likely to affect some people because of their racial status versus others, which is true. But the reason it got murky is because I researched a lot of this stuff for my book. And so I did weeks worth of archival research in the LBJ library, weeks worth of research in the Nixon library, and weeks worth of research in the Kennedy library, because those are really the three presidential administrations that tried to make sense of what the Civil Rights Act actually meant in practice. And there was never any consensus. So first, like there were some people who thought that all the Civil Rights Act needed to do was just bar discriminatory laws from existing. There were some people who thought you needed to achieve what was called racial balance. And so like equality meant that essentially making sure that Black people and women and everybody else, like all of the different populations at the aggregate level, or so like the average, reflected the demographics relative to census numbers. So if, so equality would be, making sure that 13% of CEOs were Black, making sure that 60% of CEOs were white, making sure that 11% of CEOs were whatever, or making sure that 13% of people in jail were Black and 60% were, in other words, there would be no racial disparities. So trying to create parities across the racial groups. Now, okay, so let me stop there because I kind of threw a lot on the table. So yeah.
Is providing racial balance wrong?
What do you mean by wrong? Like, as in, do I think it's good or bad, or
do you think it's good or bad, or do you think it's like contradictory to meritocracy?
I don't really. So I don't want to say, I'm not a huge fan of like ethical questions, or at least not in. I don't like to mix ethical considerations with like just like trying to objectively put the info, like what happened on the table. It depends what you're trying to go for. Like in my view in my socialist utopia that I hope one day, even if it takes 3 millennia, if the globe is still here, is I hope the race concept will have gone away altogether. And so like for me, I don't really care that much about making sure that, that the prison population is evenly distributed. I would rather create conditions where we hopefully wouldn't need to have that many people in prisons at all. Or I would rather not have us, kowtow to corporations and organize our economy in a way that we're not dictated by the need for capital accumulation, which I think would address a lot of those inequalities. And so like, I think fighting for, equality under capitalism to me seems short-sighted for no other reason than it's not going to happen. Not because people are discriminatory, not because people are rude or mean or greedy or white supremacists or whatever else people, but because like you can't undo what's already happened. Like you just can't. Like you're not going to eradicate things that happened in the past. Like you're just not going to. It's not possible. And so I think what people are attempting to do in vain is to correct for things that happened in the past. But you can't do that. So I would much rather focus on how can we construct a world going forward that is, that is a world where everybody can flourish in the sense that everyone can do things that they're passionate about, that can do things that they enjoy. That doesn't mean that people won't have to work, but hopefully the work would be work that is not alienated work, i.e. work that you just have to do to put food on the table. Like that's the world I want to build. And like just making sure that we have Black CEOs is not really going to achieve that task. Now, if your ideology is what to me, what represents equality is making sure that, 13% of CEOs are Black. I mean, I can't tell you that that's right or wrong. I'm just not committed to that as a politic.
Gotcha. So someone listed DEI isn't just about race. And I think we know this, but why do so many people focus on race then when it comes to DEI?
I think part of it is just because of the association with civil rights. And that's right. Like I said early on that like affirmative action started off focusing primarily on Black people explicitly. And then eventually they grew it to include women and people with disabilities and national origin and like all these different, demographic characteristics. But yeah, I think more so it's just because, I think that association with the civil rights movement, I think signifies to a lot of people that this is, a Black-white thing. But of course, it transcends that.
Mm. So yeah, you can finish your point in your blog that you were making. So if you want to keep going.
Yeah, so like there was no consensus as to what qualified as meritocracy, nor what the source of the inequality was. Well, let me take a step back because not everyone thinks that inequality is a problem. So like a lot of this is going to depend on what your own kind of view, and I talk about this in the blog post. It's going to view on like how you interpret the nature of the issue and what your aim is, or like what you would like to ideally see, which I don't think many people think about the latter question very much. in the sense that if, again, your idea of equality is just making sure that there's proportional representation relative to census numbers, then the type of policies or initiatives that you are going to implement to achieve that are going to be much different than if your view of equality is essentially getting beyond capitalism. So again, I think it depends on, what you're trying to achieve. But what I argue is that you can't achieve meritocracy under capitalism. So like, so then what? So then what do you do with that? And I think what I am seeing, people won't say this. I kind of wish they would say this, but people won't say it. The thing is, people don't believe that things can be better than they already are. And so like what they view equality is getting a piece of the already existing pie, not necessarily changing the composition of the pie or how we even make the pie. Like they don't think that it's possible. There's a certain pessimism about what's possible that didn't exist when the Civil Rights Act was passed. And you see this really clearly in like the archival work, or even, I study Black thought too. So like I read a lot of the things that a lot of MLK's speeches, a lot of A. Philip Randolph's speeches and his written works, and Bayard Rustin and Stokely Carmichael, all these people, and like say what you want about them, but most of them believe that things could be different. We don't think that things can be different. There's a really good book about this called Capitalist Realism, in the sense that we've all pretty much accepted that there is no alternative to capitalism, which is understandable because, as I say in the blog piece, part of what's happened over the last like half century is that there has been kind of a propagandizing of people to like get them to believe that this is the best we can do. So if you think that this is the best we can do, then it makes sense for you to, fight for like DEI, because now you're just asking for what? Representation within the existing order. But I don't accept that. I don't think that this is the best we can do. And I think that rather than trying to fight for a seat on a sinking ship, I would rather try to, salvage what we currently have, and then hopefully build something better so that everybody can actually flourish. But again, I can't tell if you think that this is the best we could do as a human society. And so like, as a result, like we just need to make sure that Target hires, X number of Black entrepreneurs that is only going to benefit a handful of people. And while the rest of the Black masses pretty much just have to work shitty jobs and have bad or no healthcare, then I mean, again, I can't tell you you're wrong for that position. That's just not the position I have. And so I do think that there is a pessimism in the sense that people don't actually believe that meritocracy is possible. But my thing is like, well, if you don't believe meritocracy is ever possible, why don't you just reject it altogether and just like, why can't we just go back to divine right? People just be where they are based on, birthright. Which we kind of have that, but like hopefully we should try to be getting beyond that. But it seems like people don't believe we can get beyond that. So yeah,
I feel like it always goes back to capitalism.
Well, yeah, capitalism it's not a pejorative. I'm like, I have another paper I'm working on trying to get people to stop thinking of capitalism as just capitalism bad, like capitalism terrible. No, like it's just that's the civilization we live in, for better or worse. And there is no external capitalism. Like we are capitalism. Every day we wake up and go to work, we're reproducing capitalism, whether we like it or not. And so like we have to figure out how do we negotiate that and like build something out of that. But I don't think people think of it in that way. I think people think of capitalism as being like, oh, this is just like, it's a rigged system that's just like benefiting just a handful of people and like especially screwing Black people harder. And I'm just like, okay, yeah, Black people might be getting screwed, but like so are like pretty much everybody except for like a handful of people. So like the whole like who's getting screwed is not really helpful. And so I think we should think more so about, well, what is it about the way we've organized our society that leads to these types of outcomes, and can we do something about that? Because if we can't ever do anything about that, then like what's the point? Like why do we even care what happens, really?
I know you also brought up in your blog about like how in capitalism like someone has to lose, and I think you made that correlation in some way to I think it was DEI or meritocracy or something. Do you remember that?
Yeah, it's just like, okay, we want, we want everybody to have a good job and access to healthcare and representation and this, that, and the other. But my whole thing is like, sure, but like there's only but so many good jobs to go around, but so many people want the types of jobs that will like let them make enough money to live comfortably without wondering what they're, whether or not they're gonna have enough savings to handle an emergency event and to like leave enough aside for them to be able to like do hood rat shit with their friends and do some self-care and shop. That's essentially what people want. Capitalism can't produce that anymore. Not for everybody. And so like increasingly fewer and fewer people, if we don't change anything about the structure of the political economy, are going to have an opportunity to experience that. And I'm not blaming people for that. I mean, that's kind of what we've been socialized to believe. I mean, why did we see so many like, all these average commercials while we were watching Saturday morning cartoons telling us to like buy all this shit and to like get our parents to take us to like Discovery Zone and Chuck E. Cheese, because like that's what we think the American dream is, to be able to just consume as much as we want. But fewer and fewer people are going to be able to do that because inequality. So like with part of the reason I talk so much about inequality is because inequality is polarizing. And so like as more people get wealthy, more people get poor. It's polarizing. And so like, what is representation going to do about that? Other than just like make sure that, I guess a few black people can get more of the stuff and more of the good stuff. And I guess everybody else can, make sure there's no disparities among the bad stuff. Like, I don't know what the aim is. Like, and so when I ask people, I'm like, well, and I asked this question at the end of my blog post, like, what do you think the purpose of DEI is? Because I don't think people really know. So let me give a little bit of historical context about the concept of diversity. So the concept of diversity was proposed in the late 1970s by a guy named Lewis Powell, who was a Supreme Court justice, who actually had been a businessman, a lawyer and a businessman early on, fairly conservative too, so there was a Supreme Court decision called the University of California Regents versus Bakke, which was really the first like major affirmative action case at the level within higher education. And essentially what the conclusion of that decision was that you couldn't have like racial quotas. So like universities couldn't say, all right, well, we're like, let's say a law school wants to admit 100 students. They couldn't say, all right, we're going to make sure that 12 students are Black, this many are women, this many are white, this many are Latino, whatever. The Supreme Court said you couldn't do that. They said that was unconstitutional. That was in the effort of trying to achieve racial balance, which they said was also unconstitutional because it flew in the face of meritocracy. And so what they said you could do rather is try to, within meritocracy, create a diverse cohort because that was good for capitalism. It was good for white people and people of different races to learn about each other, because then they could learn about each other's idiosyncrasies and different cultures. And that's where the whole multiculturalism thing came from. They can learn all these different cultures. And then once people learned all these different cultures, they would go out into the workforce and they'd be able to like implement this awareness that they have about different races in the products they were creating and how to advertise to certain racial groups. And so like, it was a very conservative idea. The idea being like, oh, well, if people understand different races, like they'll be able to like sell things to different races and we'll be able to like expand capitalism better. Now, if that's the history that people want to redeem, then fine. But I think you should be aware of like, that's the lineage, or that's the trajectory of the diversity idea. So I'm not exactly sure at what point it became, people start to associate this with being a progressive idea. Like that's what I'm still I'm doing a lot of reading on this to try to get a sense of like when that shift happened. I know that there was a market shift in the idea of color blindness. So now color blindness, and you see this a lot with how conservatives use MLK. So they'll be like, oh, like we're the ones who really support MLK because he was the one who said that, people should be judged by like the content of their character, not the color of their skin. So it is a very cynical kind of usage of color blindness. But there is something to that in the sense that they're not wrong per se, that there was this idea at one point that racial classification as such, in other words, collecting data on race, was believed to itself be racist. And so one of the debates that was happening while the Civil Rights Act was being considered was, what do you do about like racial classification? There were most Black people thought that asking people to list their race on an application was just going to lead to more racism, because they would look at the person and say, oh, they're Black, like I'm not hiring them. And so they were really leery about that. Eventually people caved in, because, you know, we live in this technocratic society where we think everything has to be about numbers. And so like people caved in, but that had consequences that I think people just kind of wave off. And so I just think there's all this history here that is just lost. It's completely lost, just completely memory hole. Like no one remembers, talks about any of this. And so I hope some of the things that I mention in some of these writings will provoke people to at least think about some of these things, as opposed to just reacting. Because what I'm seeing now is people are just like reacting, like in the sense that, oh, this is just evidence that like Trump is about to drag us to the gulags. Like they're going to be knocking on my door any second to take me to Gilead, which I don't really believe that. I'm like, okay, yeah, you think you're going to the gulag, but you're also planning this self-care vacation. So like, what's really the truth? Like, let's be honest here. And so like, people don't really believe that, but people are cynical. And that's what I'm trying to get people not to be, is like cynical about these things, right, and actually believe that something better can happen for everybody, not just Black people. Although obviously I want Black people to eat, but like, I don't want just Black people to succeed. I want everybody to have a fulfilled, promising life.
Heard. No, yeah. Also, I want to make sure, like, would you like to ask that question to the audience? What does DEI mean to you? Like, put in the comments, I guess.
Yeah, I would love to. Maybe I should. I would love to hear what people think about it. What do they think the purpose is? What do they try? If they support it, like, why do they support it? I would love to hear all these things. Again, I'm not saying you shouldn't support these things. Like, support whatever you want. I'm just trying to give people some context to think about.
Yeah. And then also
questions.
Are there any questions?
I don't know. Are there? I just thought
I can highlight some.
Okay. I didn't know I was talking, so I didn't see anything in the comments.
Is there anything that stands out? Live show, y'all. Let me get something.
Yeah, I do think a lot of people just want to answer Justin Jones's point. I do think a lot of people just want capitalism, but make it Black, which is not going to happen. So like, we've tried that. That was what Nixon. So if you go back and read Nixon's domestic platform, especially from his second term, what was it? It was Black capitalism. It was like invest in Black businesses, create investment opportunities in Black neighborhoods. That was Nixon, Republican president. That was his idea. Didn't work. Not because people didn't try hard enough, not because, people are evil, not because like white supremacy, although all those things, sure. But it didn't happen because capitalism. It happened because capital concentrates. And so if you don't do anything about the inequality, that just means fewer and fewer essentially, if we don't do anything about the inequality, people are just gonna be fighting for more and more scraps. So like, if people just want to fight for scraps, then fine. But like, I think we could be like pursuing something a little bit better than that. And I want us to be more hopeful that we can achieve something better than that.
Here are some comments on DEI. So DEI was supposed to correct the race-based discrimination that occurred when the BIPOC physically entered the room.
I don't exactly know what the physically entered the room part meant, but one thing I say is that put the comment back on the screen, please. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. So like, this is a little bit of an anachronism. So like, I would say affirmative action. There's two aspects of affirmative action. There's the negative aspect and the positive aspect. So the negative aspect of affirmative action was to bar discrimination. In other words, no business, no institution, any business, institution, whatever, it is unconstitutional for you to say that somebody cannot patronize. Target cannot put a sign on their door saying Black people can't enter. That's what that was supposed to do. Now, the positive side of that is, okay, well, we know that these places were doing that for quite some time. So what, if anything, should we do about that? And so that's where the affirmative action came from. They were saying essentially like it's not just enough to like bar the discrimination. Companies have to take affirmative action to like try to essentially correct for historical injustices. But the Supreme Court has been, the decisions about that have been tenuous. Since that they haven't been particularly interested in that kind of historical backward looking project. And so like anything dealing with, okay, so we saw this a lot with like the question of like de jure segregation and de facto segregation. So the concept of de jure segregation was like, oh, neighborhoods are segregated. Black people live in these, you know, low resource communities because of like redlining and explicit mechanisms that created that, which sure, those things existed and that's objectively true. But what ended up happening is that after redlining was dismantled, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, you still had inequality persisting. And people were like, well, what the fuck? Like, we got rid of discrimination. So like, why is there still all of this, like, you know, why are Black people still not, up here? And people are like, well, people are, it's not just explicit discrimination. That's when you started hearing stuff like implicit bias and stuff like that, or unintentional consequences. When the Supreme Court has consistently said, like, disparate, what they call disparate impact or disparate impact. What they keep saying is like, yeah, you can't really prove if somebody like implicitly feels some kind of way. And so you also can't really go based on outcomes to prove that there's discrimination. So like that gets kind of tenuous too. So we're kind of at an impasse because, again, capitalism isn't really good at dealing with things that are implicit or not spoken. That's why there's such an emphasis on laws and rules and like explicitly stating things, because everything has to be data driven. So like, how do you prove that somebody has implicit bias? You could just say that, everybody does, but then what do you do with that? So like, I'm not saying that it's not true that people don't implicitly feel some kind of way, but what I am saying is that the legal system really can't do much with that. And repeatedly, like when people have tried to like, argue on that, they've run up against courts who are like we don't really have much to say about that.
So also I want to comment on like the reaction to all of this from the public. So Target, Walmart, Amazon. Like, I want to know, what do you think of people like trying to boycott now? And then, you see people like also with Meta and how that's going. Like, I think Facebook rolled back their DEI as well or something. And now people are saying, well, I'm about to get off Twitter. not get off Twitter. I'm about to get off Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that. Boycotting like that. Because I remember, like, Amanda Seale, she made it. I sent you that post where she was just like, I'm boycotting this. I'm going dark. Make sure you look for me on Patreon, stuff like that. Or just people saying, well, I'm not shopping at Target anymore. Like, I just told somebody today, because I just came from Target because it's just close to me and they have cheap water. But I mentioned that to somebody and it was just like, oh no, you're not supposed to be shopping at Target anymore. I'm just like, oh God. And the thing is, like, for me, it's just like, I feel like it's like a slippery slope, because I still have an iPhone. Like, it's hard to just boycott everything is what I'm saying.
There's no ethical consumption under capitalism. I mean, really what it is just making people
can you repeat that?
There's no ethical consumption under capitalism. Like, that's not a thing. Really what it is people want to feel like they can do something because they feel helpless. And so that's a gesture or an action they can do that makes them feel as though they're like working towards some goal. But what I think the problem is people don't know what that goal is, or at least they don't explicitly state it. So my question is always like, well, what is the point of the boycott? Boycotts are not ends in themselves. Boycotts are means to ends. They're tactics. And so you need to understand, like, you need to think very carefully about like what the function or what the purpose of that particular tactic is within whatever broader goal that you have. And so what do you think people want out of the boycott? Like, what do you think they hope it achieves? What do you think? I'm curious. I don't know.
Well, I guess if they if you take away your dollar or something like that, maybe they'll feel it financially, and then they're going to have to go back to what they were doing.
Yeah, no, they're not going back. So that's not the way capitalism works. So okay, I'm gonna just put words in people's mouths because people don't put their. Now, one thing you can say about me is I put my cards in the table, so I don't equivocate. You know exactly where I stand about things. But like a lot of people don't say what they actually where they actually stand on things. They use metaphors and like shrouded in all kind of like colorful language that has me like whatever that means. But so let me try to put words in people's mouths. I think people who are espousing these protests or these boycotts are like, oh, well, we pressure Target, like it'll essentially get them to see how bad the wrongness of their ways. I don't know, or how terrible rolling back DEI is, and they're going to reinstate it. It's just like, yeah, no, they're not going to do that. But this is what they probably will do. Let's say the boycott works, and let's say that it really does hurt like Target's like Q1 numbers, like it actually hurt. How is Target going to respond to that? So let's remember, Target is not a thing. We talk about corporations like they're things, like they're things we can touch. Target is an abstraction. When we walk into a Target store, really what you're walking into is a constructed building with colors and signs and things on it. But really what Target is a handful of very wealthy people managing a business and making money from that business. And so like, let's imagine that again, their profits are in fact hurt. They'll say, oh, okay, well, if that's the case, we just need to like shut down, X number of stores and, lay off all these people. So like the people who will probably be most affected by that are the rank and file people who work in the Target retail stores, who are going to be disproportionately women, because women are disproportionately likely to be hired to work in retail spaces or in the service economy generally. It's going to be people of color, because people of color are the predominant, or make up the lion's share of the working class. And then the very wealthy people at the top are going to, get a bigger cut because they will have shed the fat, which is what businesses do. That's why you go to business school. You go to business school so you can learn how to navigate these situations when your profits are down quarter by quarter. And the reason they're going to do that isn't just because they hate Black people or women or whoever. They're going to do it because they're in business to do one thing, which is to make money. And to do your job well, if you work at Target, it is to ensure that Target as an abstraction is making money, i.e. the wealthy people who invest in your firm are getting a return on that investment. So I'm not sure how a boycott of Target or any of these businesses is going to achieve the reinstating of DEI. Like that's not going to happen. But this is also another thing where people don't think through the logic of the situation, which is if you go read. And so when I was working my dissertation, one thing I did is I read a lot of the I'm such a nerd. I read a lot of textbooks from business schools to get a sense of what they were teaching people. And like one thing that was always talked about with diversity is like, we should do diversity because it's good for profits. And I was always like, well, anybody can fucking see how that's going to work, because what happens if profits fall? DEI is going to be blamed for it. It's going to be a scapegoat, which is exactly what happened. And so like people don't actually think strategically about these things. They just react, and like hopefully people will think a little bit more strategically. But before you can think strategically, you have to have a vision of where you're trying to go. Like boycotts arose really systematically out of the Great Depression, because what you saw was that once people had a lot more disposable income, and once the United States turned into a consumer economy in the late 1930s, really during World War II, this idea that you could hurt it really was in the South with Black people where you started to really see it. Not just Black people, because also like white ethnics in the North who were discriminated against, especially in the early 20th century. But really part of what the boycott did was to actually hit smaller businesses, mom and pop stores. Now, if that's what people were targeting, then I think that could actually make a difference, because smaller businesses are not as capital intensive and they don't have as much cash on hand. And so like, if they miss, 3 or 4 or 5 days of revenue, like that can actually like really harm them. That's not going to harm Target. And also, most of these businesses have qualified as too big to fail. So even if they did like end up losing a lot of money, the Treasury and the Fed would probably like convene and like bail them out. And so like, yeah, people just need to be a little bit more attuned to the political economy. And I get it. People want to do something. They want to feel like they can change something. I get all of that. But like, you still have to be like strategic and thorough in how you think about these things, so that if you do in fact want to affect something, you can be if you do want to actually change something, you can be effective. And so people will listen to me say all this and be like, oh, Jared's just being a hating ass bitch. And I'm just like, no, but like somebody has to like be honest with people. And I'm not here to sell people dreams. You can just go listen to Joy Reid for that. So
Ooh, well, I heard that. Well, this is actually a segue into the article that you sent me. I feel like if Target sees a decline in YOY sales and Costco reports a surge, they will absolutely rethink their strategy.
yeah, they might rethink it, but that doesn't mean it's just gonna reimpose diversity, equity, inclusion as such. Also, like I always tell people, if you really want diversity, equity, and inclusion to really, if you really want more Black faces in high places, as they used to say, you should also be socialist, because capitalism again is going to start creating more and more inequality, which means there's going to be fewer Black people. You're seeing it now, fewer Black people going to college, which means there are going to be fewer Black people entering in corporate spaces, which means there'll be fewer Black people in positions of like the upper echelon, which is really what this is about. It's just like upperly mobile, or people who have desires of being upperly mobile, college educated people looking for opportunities. That's really what this is about. Like if you make Chipotle bowls, like you don't care about diversity, like that doesn't matter to you. So like only certain jobs apply. I'm sorry, DEI really only applies to like certain jobs. Like if you clean bathrooms for a living, like do you care like how diverse, like do you care that the housekeeping staff is diverse? Like probably not. But so it depends on the job. And I'm like, yeah, businesses are always reevaluating things, but like I'm a believer in history. And so I don't believe you can ever turn the clock back. I don't think that's possible. I don't think you should even desire that. And so like, I believe you always have to build anew out of what has changed, for better or worse. And so like trying to like go back is always reactionary to me. And I think I would rather strategize about how you do things differently moving forward, as opposed to trying to recreate something that existed in the past. Like I feel like that's where we are right now, because we don't have any imagination, and we also don't have any very little like historical understanding of how we got to where we got. And so people just keep trying to reinvent the wheel and do things that have maybe worked in the past. But the reason that certain things worked in the past is because at that time the conditions were much different. And so rather than like adjust the conditions and build something out of that, people are like, well, we did it like this like 40 years ago and it worked then. I'm like, yeah, but that was 40 years ago. So like, that doesn't mean you can't learn from the past, but like you can't recreate it and you can't change it. So like, be more forward looking as opposed to trying to retrieve something that I think there's also like, you know how I feel about nostalgia. So
well said. So lastly, this article that you sent was Al Sharpton leads buy-in at Harlem Costco to support their DEI policies. Now, what's wrong with that? You know, like I feel like it seems like a good thing. Like I think what he did was he provided like gift certificates or something like that for people. They all did like this massive like shopping at the Harlem Costco or something because they're sticking by their DEI strategy. This is what he said. He said, why do we have DEI? We have DEI because you denied us diversity. You denied us equity. You denied us inclusion. DEI was a remedy to racial institutionalized bigotry practice in academia and in these corporations. Now, if you want to put us back in the back of the bus, we're going to do the Dr. King Rosa Parks on you, Sharpton said. I can totally see him saying that. And I was going to say in the Al Sharpton voice, but I decided against it.
Oh God. Well, I just gave you the history of diversity. So like
Right.
respectfully, I think Al Sharpton is entirely wrong about that. But even let's assume even if he was right about that, that the point of diversity was to like do what he claimed it did or was trying to do, which I don't think is right. And I think I'm on pretty solid historical footing. But you can decide for yourself. Like nothing, don't take me at my word. Go read it. Like everything I talk about, you can go read all of the archives are publicly open. Many of them are digitized. You can go on the internet and like read all the same things that I'm reading. And maybe you might have a different interpretation. I don't know. But we've really lost the plot if we think helping a corporation is good for Black people? Like helping a corporation isn't good for really anybody besides the owners of that corporation. So I don't see the connection. I don't know. Like I don't believe in I believe Milton Friedman is a conservative economist, and people already think I'm conservative for whatever reason. But Milton Friedman is a conservative economist, and he published an opinion piece in the New York Times back in the 70s or maybe the early 80s. And he says corporations have one responsibility to their shareholders. Now, of course, he was being somewhat flippant, but he was being honest about that in the sense that, sure, we talk about corporate responsibility and corporations doing this, that, and the other for society, but I'm like, that's ideology. Of course, corporations are going to say that they care about people because they want people to believe that, but like, they really care about their investors, not because they're evil and don't care about anybody else. They might be, but because there is like a fiduciary responsibility to do that. And so like, what is people need to think about like what is the point of the institution? Like why does a corporation exist? Why does Costco really care aside from having more Black people in executive positions to give legitimacy to their business, i.e. to make more money? Everything's going to be at the service of making more money. Now, if you think that there is something radical about, Black people being a part of a project of making more money for Costco, then sure, I could see how that boycott could work. I don't. And so like, I don't really care. I think I think there's a historical sleight of hand there in that people don't recognize the conservative origins of diversity. And again, I don't mean conservative in like, it's a bad thing. Like we've gotten to this point where people think conservative bad, like conservative racist. I don't mean it that way. What I mean is conservatism as a political ideology is the notion that the existing social world, the social order, cannot be changed, conserved. That's the most literal interpretation.
And I think people need to hear that. Like, I think a lot of people focus on good and bad.
Yeah, get out of the, we can do a whole episode on the way that liberal and conservative and have been completely distorted in terms of like what they mean. Now all they just mean, they don't mean anything to people, they just signify things. So when people hear conservative, they hear racist, white men, trying to take the country back, hates immigrants. Then when they hear liberal, they hear, like supports Black people, supports women, embraces diversity, wants to protect people, harm reduction. Like that's what they hear. But all of that is ideology. None of that is legitimate. Conservatism just means, again, you don't believe that essentially history is over and that human beings can't do anything different than what we're already doing as far as like organizing the social world is. So because we have to conserve that, you essentially form your politics kind of within this idea that things can't change, which is where I kind of think of diversity. So like if you don't think things can change, then it would make sense that you just want to do what you can to like make sure that there is, proportional representation by race. But you're never going to get proportional representation under capitalism. And so that's the kind of the contradiction because there's so much inequality. And so unless you have like a massive, I don't know, people will say that's why we need reparations. And I could do a whole episode about that one.
I know.
But I'm like, okay, we barely can get like universal healthcare. So like, what makes you think reparations is on the table? But even if we could, like reparations actually wouldn't solve the issue. I have another idea about this, but that's just never gonna, I don't know when I'm gonna get around to this, but reparations would only work under socialism. I'm not even saying you should or shouldn't support reparations. That's up for you to decide. But like, if you just had reparations under capitalism, what would happen is we would give Black people all this money, and JP Morgan Chase would essentially say, all right, like, let's just raise housing prices like threefold. And there would just be another intense inflation because you would have to lower people's living standards and like lower their purchasing power, which is what inflations do. So part of the reason we had the inflation in 2020, the media doesn't talk about it this way, but really the reason we had the inflation in 2020 is because the government felt like working people had too much money and they were like exacerbating supply. And so the way that you suppress demand, or at least suppress how much the working class can buy, is by you raise prices. Because when you raise prices, obviously you can buy less. And so, but again, it wasn't like an evil scheme set up. What's the Housewives, the evil scheme set up by Todd?
The scheme set up by Todd.
It wasn't like anything like that. It's just like a business imperative. It's just like, oh, well, like if you're running if you're Walmart, you're like, okay, well, this is a good time to raise prices because, you know, people have a little extra money to spend. So like, we're in business to make money. So like, let's take advantage of that. And so like, that's what corporations and big businesses were told to do. So like McKinsey, the big consulting firm, had a whole plan called rapid revenue recovery, which is they were like, okay, you have a window here to raise prices and like really try to make up for the profits you lost during COVID, during the shutdown. And so like, that's what would happen with reparations. Like if there was in fact a reparations program, I'd be willing to bet it would be met by an immediate hyperinflation. And so that would just pretty much negate the entire purpose of it. And so I'm like, trying to salvage capitalist politics to me just seems like a losing cause. I would rather imagine something different collectively.
Can I just say to the chat, did y'all catch all those gems just now? Like just like raindrops. Like there was so many gems in that. Oh my God, you like really explained that and really took us on that little short journey. I appreciate that. I didn't see it that way, but I totally, yeah.
Thank you. It really frustrates me the way that the media talked about inflation, because they just made it seem like it just fell out of the sky. Like it was just like a natural disaster or something. I'm like, no, like this was, there was a purpose to it. Like it wasn't just an accident. Like, and some of it is spontaneous in the sense that once one business starts doing it, it's like a race to the bottom, because if you don't start raising your prices, then you might lose out. And so like there is this kind of spontaneous way in which inflations happen, but like the original kind of like motivation or the original kind of impetus behind them is very much around reducing how much people can buy, because there's either a shortage of things that people want or businesses are trying to recoup revenue. Like that's essentially what the function of it is. But the way the media talks about it, they just make it seem like it's some complex technical issue that you need like a PhD in econ to understand. I'm just like, it's not that complicated.
Right. I guess to close out, since we're reaching an hour now, just what can the average person do? Because, we always be feeling like powerless or whatever, but like, what could the average person do about this situation?
As I've said before, I know this sounds very pie in the sky and very Pollyanna, but I think people need to learn how to be social again, because any massive change is going to require it to come from working people. Like people who are wealthy, that's the irony of it. So Marx essentially says like, the irony of capitalism is, it's the working class that is going to have to like overcome it. And yet, paradoxically, the working class are the ones who are most immiserated by the way that we've organized our society. So there's that contradiction there, as in the people who are most immiserated are the ones who, are just trying to survive, are really going to be the ones who are tasked with overcoming it, which sounds kind of like unfair in a lot of respects, but it's true. Because if things work for you, like if you're Warren Buffett, like why would you want to change the way? Sure, you might want to get the margins, but like you're not gonna want to like overhaul the way that we relate to each other socially and economically. Like you have no desire to. And so I think, again, the only way that we're going to have like any type of like positive wholesale change, I think, is to not to toot our own horn, but I think a lot more of this, more trying to think very systematically about what's going on, be open-minded to being wrong, being open-minded to negativity, being open-minded to ambiguity, about uncertainty. Like I don't know. Like I don't know what can happen. The thing with history is that change usually happens like things are always changing. So like that's like a truism. Like people be like, oh, nothing has changed. I'm just like, well, the leaves fell off the tree, so something changed. So change is always going to happen. So like the question is like, well, what type of change? And like nobody can answer that. We have to figure it out together. But if we all just like, cynical and like distrustful of each other and like think everybody's out to get us and that everybody is a hater, then like how are you going to ever do that? Like, so you have to be able to be in a position to forward some kind of solidarity. Otherwise, we're just going to be what we're doing. We're going to keep doing what we're doing, which is get on Twitter and doom scroll and like, punch air while Elon Musk makes another, $100 billion this year. So yeah, we just need to learn how to be trusting of each other and understand that, there's more working people than there are that aren't. And that, yeah, we have to figure out a way to connect each other and start figuring it out.
Cool. I mean, well said. And yeah,
I don't want to give people the impression that there's an exit strategy or that there's a back door out of this or that there's a break glass in case there's none of that. So like we just have to learn how to be social again. Start there and then we can work our way up. And you're not going to vote your way out of this. Like that's not going to happen either. So sorry.
Well, y'all, that was our time for today. Hopefully y'all learned something. I definitely did. If you have any questions for Jared, you can put them in the comments. I think he goes back and reads the comments a lot. And also let us know in the chat, like, what does DEI really mean to you? And are you for it or, against it?
Please actually do answer this because a lot of the comments that people are making have been really helpful in helping me shape my thoughts about this and like the papers I'm working on. So that would actually help me a ton. Because I mean, I actually am trying to like generally get to the root of like, what is it that people are debating and like what is it that people are striving for or against? Because people aren't putting their cards on the table. There's a lot of like equivocating, a lot of ideology, and so I'm trying to like parse through that.
Okay. And y'all know where y'all can find Jared, JC Tiger fan. It's in his little name right there. I'm glad he actually put it up there now. And then look at his blog too to see what we were referring to. If you could just put that in the comments and then I can pin it for you. And yeah.
Let's see.
You can do that later, but I'm just saying, like, just put it in the comment and I'll pin it.
Okay. Well, I think you have a link to my blog page under the description. So if they just go there, it's literally the first thing that
people be lazy, so yeah, you can put it in the comment section too.
Okay.
But with that, y'all, if you enjoyed this, please give us a like and yes, subscribe to A Ninja too. And we will see y'all for the next chat. All right. Bye, y'all.